Eli. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Colonel Eli Baron. You are, as many of the students in front of whom you've spoken during the course of tours with our organization, you are the immediate past Deputy Military Advocate General of the Israel Defense Forces. You also concluded your career in the Israel Defense Forces as an instructor at the National Defense College. And you are somebody that I've known since 2014, if I'm not mistaken. I believe exactly. February of 2014.
Yeah.
We'll come to how our friendship and relationship and collaborations first came about. But I'd like to begin by thanking you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of the work that you've undertaken. And I also want to emphasize that we find you at an interesting point in your career because you're here speaking in your own personal capacity about your experiences within the MAG standing for the Military Advocate General's Corps. And we're going to go through a little bit about your career and so on and so forth. But if I may, I'd like to call you Eli.
Yes, please do.
Or as they say in Texas, Eli.
Yeah.
But we won't call you Eli. We'll call you Eli for the purpose of our time together. And thank you and welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Looking forward to this conversation with you.
Great. So I'd like to begin by you telling the people who are listening a little bit about your personal circumstances and your background. Where are you born? Where do you live? Wife, children, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I was born in Ramat Gan. That's a city very close to Tel Aviv. Both my parents were born in Baghdad, Iraq. They came to Israel. They made Aliyah in 1951. They were actually expelled, like all the Jewish community in Iraq. They were expelled from Iraq in 1951. So they came as refugees. But if you'll tell them they were refugees, they will never accept that. For them, they made Aliyah to Israel, and they never looked back. So I grew up in a home where the Arab culture was very much present, and I loved it, like the music and the language. And my parents were very proud of their background. There was a Jewish community in Iraq in Babylon for 2,000 years. So that was a very strong part of my life for many years, and it is today. But we grew up as, they became contributing Israeli citizens, very proud. My father has served in the military, my mom in the textile industry. So that was my childhood. During high school, I had already, like many other Israelis, I had my dreams about the military service. I was dreaming of becoming a combatant in one of our reconnaissance elite units, Sayeret Matkal, as we call it in Hebrew. I was training for that for 2 years, trying to hide a medical issue I had from the IDF doctors. Unfortunately for me, or maybe fortunately enough, these doctors outsmarted me, and they found about my problems. They told me, you will never go there. So I decided to go to what we call the academic reserve. That's a way of deferring your military service, going to university to get your degree, academic degree, before your service. I went to law school in Tel Aviv University, and then I was inscripted to the IDF as a lawyer. During my service, which I'm sure we'll be able to talk about, I also knew my wife, Tamar. We met in a trip to Africa. She's from Jerusalem, and she very fast exiled me to Jerusalem after we came back to Israel. We got married. We have 3 kids, 3 wonderful kids. I have a 17-year-old daughter, Yarden, who's about to go to the military at the end of the year. And I have 2 sons, Ophir, 15, and Yoav, 11.
Did you speak Arabic from your upbringing, or did you learn Arabic along the course of your career?
Yeah, so, my parents were not really speaking Arabic at home. They were speaking Arabic with their parents. But, the sound of the language was not... I could get it. Like I was hearing it for many years, but I got my Arabic from work, for many years of communicating with Arabs in work.
But there was a natural introduction to the sounds and the rhythm of the language that you gathered from home, and then it was easier to...
And I always loved it very much. I love the sound of Arabic.
So that's something that during our travels I've had the chance to listen to you speaking, and I find that very, very interesting. But you actually never had any plans then to become a lawyer. This is something that you almost stumbled into because you were considering what your fate or your future would be in the military. Is that correct? Did I understand that?
Yeah, and that was almost coincidental. Like I remember that back in time of high school, when I realized I will not be going to that elite unit, I just look at the list of the things you could learn in the academic reserve, and those words, at the top of the list, like the threshold to getting inside the law school for the academic reserve was the highest, and I said, okay, let's do that. But
because of the challenge.
Yeah, but I never had a dream of becoming a lawyer. That things happen to you in life. I don't regret that, but it was never really planned.
So you enroll in your legal studies. Now, in advance of doing that, you're obviously obligated to the IDF for a period thereafter to do your service within the MAG Corps. How long do you have to sign for?
3 more years, 3 extra years. So you had the 3 mandatory years of service, and then you sign for 3 extra years.
And you begin your service immediately as an officer, effectively after your studies, or not?
Yeah. You graduate and you go straight to officer's course in Bahad Echad, that's in Mitzpe Ramon in Israel.
What exactly is the MAG Corps? So the MAG Corps, of course, stands for the Military Advocate General's Corps of the Israel Defense Forces. What's the position and role of the MAG Corps? And then I'd also like to say, because I imagine this is the case, that what it was then is 1,000 miles removed from what it is today in terms of its centrality to combat and to conflict and so forth.
Yes. So the MAG Corps is the legal corps of the IDF. So it's there's nothing new about the corps itself. It was established in 1948 when the IDF itself was established. So we always had lawyers in the IDF. But obviously, throughout the years, the corps has grown bigger, taking more responsibilities, and obviously in the sense that you'll be referring to the involvement of the legal corps, in the process of planning warfare and giving real-time legal advice during warfare. That's something that has evolved maybe in the last decades. So obviously, the level of exposure of the IDF of warfighting and also other militaries in the world has increased in the last decades, and that also brought about also more involvement of international bodies, more issues of international law being considered when you deal with the fighting. So we also injected more lawyers to that process throughout the years. So the MAG Corps will deal with everything that has to do with enforcement, law enforcement inside the IDF, meaning
internal investigations of soldiers,
investigating and prosecuting soldiers, officers for various offenses, also giving them the defense counseling. So we also have that. It's not only the prosecution; they also have the defense counseling provided by the MAG Corps, and giving all the legal advice needed for all IDF bodies, giving the legal training both for the lawyers and for the commanders in the IDF. So these all these functions inside the MAG Corps. It's a very big legal corps, approximately 1,000 lawyers, about 300 in active duty, and the rest in reserve forces. And our reservists are being called upon for the service a few times a year, so we meet them all the time. We're in constant contact with them to allow us to get them always updated as to what is the law in the military and
who is that bank of reservists? Who are they? Are these tax lawyers? Are these real estate lawyers who then turn their hand and their talents towards whatever it is you task them with, or have they all gone through some service in the MAG Corps? How exactly does that work?
So that's a very good question. So many of them have indeed been serving during their active duty service in the MAG Corps. So they will be officers that had a chance to serve for a few years in the MAC Corps, and then they returned for reserve service over there. And many of them will be just, top-notch lawyers from the private sectors, who were like combatants, infantry officers or armor officers or whatever in their active duty service. And then, after a few years in doing reserve service, they want to contribute from their professional capabilities, and they would ask to be moved into the MAC Corps, and we have many of these. And it's very also important for us to also have officers with combat experience, because it allows us to be able to communicate with the operational echelon of the IDF better. It's very important that you have also people in the process that have combat experience and legal capabilities, and they can combine both of them together. That gets you to a very good result in this communication.
So the MAG Corps is dealing in no small part with prosecutions and enforcement of the law within the actions of the IDF soldier in day-to-day experiences. It's dealing with investigations into armed conflict, hot conflict, if I can speak about it that way. We'll come to that in a moment. How about other things such as prisoner exchanges? Is the MAG Corps involved in that sort of thing? When, for example, the exchanges that were brought about to return Gilad Shalit home?
Yeah, so the MAC Corps will be involved in anything the IDF is involved. So if you talk about this specific prisoners exchange, I was very much involved in it as the legal advisor of the IDF in the West Bank, because in order to apply the conditions for that prisoner exchange, you had to get the general of the Central Command of the IDF to sign all the release forms of those prisoners that were part of the exchange. So I knew many of them, because I knew many of them either as a prosecutor, because for many years I was a prosecutor, both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip.
What years were those when you were a prosecutor?
Well, I started in 1994, and I was a prosecutor until the year 2000. So for 6 years I was a military prosecutor, and then for a few years more I was a military judge. During the four first years of the what's called the Second Intifada, the Palestinian uprising. So I was also sitting as a judge in many of the prisoners that were released in that exchange. So I had the chance to see this cycle from many different angles, both a prosecutor and a military judge and a legal advisor involved in the process of releasing them. And then also in the process, many of them were then detained for violating the conditions for their release. So I was also involved in that. So you get to see many angles of the same issue.
How does that feel to be somebody who's responsible for the successful prosecution and then equally engaged in the release of that same individual, just on a personal level?
I'm whatever I do, I'm trying to be very professional about it, not get too much sentiment involved. It's not always possible. Like when you engage with the families of victims, for instance, there is no way of being only professional about that. You will always have the personal contact that you develop with them, and there's always part of that, but you have to make sure it will not intervene in the process of making the professional decisions. So you realize what's the rationale for that move, and you're just there to facilitate that. It was also I remember the moments when we've seen Gilad Shalit on the screen. So it was
coming back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was so moving for all of us. This issue was with us for 5.5 years when he was held in captivity. We were all expecting his return. So it was on that level. I would say it was not professional. I was just like any other Israeli happy, looking forward for the release of one of our boys who was taken into illegal captivity. But obviously you never forget who the people who were released were, what they did. You know that, but that's just part of your professional life. You have to be professional about that.
So the MAGCOR really came onto my radar in 2014, and it did so because we were out giving lectures from campus to campus to campus in the United States, and then we thought, well, how do you really zone in and tap into future leadership? And a disproportionate number of elected officials in the US emanate from legal backgrounds. As I always try to express, it's not a thorough rule, but it's very, very reliable. So if one wants to tap into future leadership, that's probably a very, very good place to start. And we were looking for high-quality lecturers, professional lecturers, experts in their field. And so we turned to the MAGCOR, and I don't think I'm mistaken, I believe it was in February 2014 when you and I first met.
Yeah, I believe around that time.
And you gave the go-ahead to start dispatching officers. You came first.
Yeah.
Why? Why did you see the importance of that work? And why did you... I can well imagine that they're exceptionally busy. Each and every one of your officers, you were in your capacity as the DMAG. Why do you say, yes, I'm on board with this idea? And if you could answer it not with a particular reference to our work, but generally, the purpose of bringing a message to a larger audience.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's just set the record straight, right? You tricked me into that meeting, right?
Did I?
You never said you're interviewing me for getting to one of these tours. They told me from
That's
the
true.
IDF spokesperson unit is there's this gentleman here, he would like to know more about the legal operation of the IDF, and that was
Right.
the meeting. And the whole tour thing started right after that. But at the same time, like I've been doing I've been doing what we call public diplomacy for so many years. But because I deeply am very much of the belief that it's not enough just to do what's legal and what's right. It's also very important to let the world know about that, because nobody knows what are the challenges we contend with, how difficult it is to deal with all these challenges in the environment in which we operate, the IDF operates, the State of Israel operates. And this is why, for me, it was a chance, to get the truth out there. And you opened the doors for us to do so. And I was happy to allow more and more lawyers after me to do just the same. My first experience with Also Just Speak was very positive. I saw how capable you were in opening all those venues for us, very influential venues. We went to think tanks and big law firms, and it was very important, all these law schools. And when we have very capable lawyers, so I thought it's very important, to send them to all these places where they will be able to engage with different audiences and tell them about our operation. Now, it should be said that I was never looking, when you advocate about these things, mm-hmm. you never have a purpose of getting people to love Israel. That's not it. Maybe some people will, maybe some people already are, but you only, for me it has always been giving these people a chance to ask us, lawyers in the process, or other officers that you bring in the process of decision making in the IDF, get an access to us, realize how it is being done, and give them a chance to ask all the hard questions. They can be critical, that's okay. You have to handle criticism that is leveled at you. But being sincere and being also very open about, speaking about mistakes that you sometimes make, because we are all humans, we have dilemmas, and sometimes we make the wrong calls. Giving them the ability to realize how it works, that's it. For me, it was always very important that it will not be just, there's a Hebrew word for that, hasbara.
Right.
Okay, just explaining. No, that's
Right.
not enough.
Hasbara actually translates to explaining.
Explaining,
Right.
yeah, but that's not that. It's more of a dialogue.
Right.
Okay, because it is through the dialogue that they can shape their opinions.
And a very substantive dialogue. I mean, when you and your officers come over here, you're feeding red meat to the audience. It's very substantive. It's very clear. There are exhibits and photographs and so forth. And I agree with you. I've never actually understood the idea that one should walk into a room with the view to making the entire audience fall in love with the cause that
that will
you're
not
representing.
happen.
I just don't think it's realistic.
Exactly. But I mean, after all, what's happening is, in many cases, you will hear, actually, there were some cases in which I heard some criticism, some questions from the audience that made me think after that. Maybe we should take other considerations into the process, and I'll speak with the officers about that. Maybe we should change the something in the operational planning. So that's also very important to us. It's not a one-way street; it's a two-way street.
Right.
Getting so much from them, and you never have. I believe that you never have the same group going in and out of the conversation.
In terms of their mindset.
Yeah,
right.
Because if you are being sincere, candid about everything, and if you allow them to really ask all the questions they have and engage with you, they will never leave the room the same way they did. They might be just as critical, but they will at least know that there's a human face behind all the decisions they're criticizing.
Yeah.
It's someone whose morals, whose values are no different than theirs.
Mm-hmm.
They can criticize his bottom line decisions, his process sometimes, but at least they know it's someone they can have a dialogue with. It's not someone who has a total viewpoint of the world than theirs.
And I also think that it's only by getting out to a sophisticated, and they are a sophisticated audience. I mean, these are law students in some of the top tier law schools. Maybe we'll get a chance to speak about them specifically. But it's only by subjecting oneself to their questions that one really has the opportunity to learn by way of those questions, rather than what you would hope would be the questions. And I think that the ability for you to put the best of your talents and your officer's talents in front of that really speaks volumes to the confidence you have in the case. And with regard to confidence in the case, I want to try and bring a little bit of an analogy here. And then we'll come back to some of the legal investigations and procedures and so forth that I've learned about by way of you. The state of Israel is under certain threats on a daily basis. Those can be from the Gaza Strip, from Lebanon, from Syria, from within our borders. But the people who are charged with the defense of the state of Israel very rarely have a broad base that is critical of their task to defend the country. In other words, the vast majority of Israelis are supportive on the whole, without getting into political issues as to whether or not Israel ought to be in Judea and Samaria or not be in Judea. They're supportive of the soldier, and they're supportive of the soldiers. Now, when I heard you, first of all, do you agree with that premise?
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I heard you for the first time, I remember speaking to Rosita, my partner in the work that we do, and I said to her, listening to this fellow, it's very clear that Israel's also under massive attack, and I would say unrelenting attack in the legal realm. And what we have is this band of very talented, very dedicated legal professionals who are fending this off day and night on an ongoing basis, brilliantly, by the way, just doing it brilliantly. And yet there is a question there in the mindset of the pro-Israel audience, both domestically and internationally, and it was just reiterated a few weeks ago, that says, that wonders, is the presence and the involvement of the Mag Corps a good thing or a bad thing in the mindset of a soldier, in the capabilities of a soldier and a commander? How do you answer that question?
Okay, so that's a very good question. First of all, let's start with what I think. I think that
By the way, sorry, just so that I actually want to preempt you with this, I think it's unquestionably good.
yeah, okay,
Unquestionably good.
Thank you.
So, but I do want to know what you think.
So
about
obviously, I couldn't agree with you more. There's no way the IDF could have succeeded in its operation without the legal involvement in the world in which we live today. Okay, so let's just put it on the table. The world, the way the world judges us is in many ways very legalistic. You have many legal bodies all around the world, international bodies, domestic bodies that judge the operation, that analyze the operations of the IDF in legal terms. So there's no way of doing that without embedding lawyers in all the processes within the IDF. Now, I don't expect you talked about the soldiers, especially junior soldiers. I don't expect them to understand the whole, like how the world operates in broad terms. Okay,
Right.
they have a mission to complete. If he's an infantry soldier, he has to be, he has to obey orders and win the war. That's his job. And this is why you have his commander and the commander above him and the commander above him. Usually, you will not be able to explain all the legal complexities to the very, to the lowest echelons of the military. That does not work like that anywhere. But you will be able to teach them. So the concept of what we call purity of arms,
Right.
okay, using your arms only for military purposes, etc. That's an embodiment of a legal term in international law that we will call distinction. We can talk about that later. So we do expect our soldiers to know that. And it's not hard to do that because they all go to the same schools we do. They hear stories about the IDF, about the morality of the IDF, and nobody is being enlisted to the IDF with the intent to violate that rule. So you don't need to be you don't need them to cite articles of international law treaties. That's not the point. But you do want them, as they progress through the ranks, to know more about legal obligations. So obviously the IDF chief of staff, the general staff of the IDF, all the peoples in the process of operational and planning, targeting, etc., senior commanders on the battlefield who make the big decisions as to fighting and targeting, etc. They all have to know more about the law, and we will communicate with them. Usually not with the junior soldiers. So I realized that sometimes the soldiers might look at the legal operations of the war of the IDF, maybe think they're impeding their fighting or whatever. But I don't expect them to realize what it is, the advantages of having all the lawyers in this process.
Mm-hmm. But you said something there that I want to give you a chance to also refine, because I've heard you say it publicly at many of the events. You have this situation whereby you're prosecuting wars in the world in which we live today.
Yeah.
And the world in which we live today is very, very different in terms of what people see and what people are watching and what they have access to when it comes to the actions of any military campaign. Now, that's one aspect of it, but there's another aspect of it, and you have emphasized that they work in tandem one with the other, and that is there's an accountability first and foremost to ourselves, and I think that you believe that even supersedes considerations of the outer world. Is that correct? And if it is correct, can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So that's very obvious that even though you do everything in order to make sure that everything is being done lawfully, you always have the obligation also to investigate cases in which there are allegations that something went wrong or was even wrong by malice of an individual soldier.
Mm-hmm.
So we have all these mechanisms in place to investigate all these allegations, and the appropriate cases, we will also have to prosecute them. So if you had a soldier fighting in Gaza and got into a private residence of a Palestinian and saw some money and took it, that's not the IDF spirit. You will bring him before court, a military court, and you will deal with that, because this is what you have to. The Israeli public expects you to do it. The international community expects you to do it, and the first one to report that will be the commander of that soldier. Let me tell you that. So it's that clear. Nobody is trying to hide these cases, but after hundreds of cases we've been investigating in these areas, let me tell you that in most cases, what you will find is at the very, I'm not talking about very clear criminal behavior such as looting, okay? But when it comes to decisions in the operational process or during fighting itself, professional decisions that a combatant makes on the battlefield, usually you will not find any, what we call in international law, any war crime. Okay, you might find a misjudgment in implying and exercising the discretion. You might find a deviation from IDF orders, but usually these orders are drafted in the first place in a way which will be much more restrictive than international law. So you might see a deviation from IDF orders, but it will be still within the contour, the perimeter of what international law allows you to do.
Right.
So this is why and most public don't realize that when you tell them he deviated from the orders. So we tell you, so he's a war criminal. No, he's not a war criminal.
Right, there's an enormous space
there's a lot of margin.
Right.
And it's intentionally like that. So the margin was created in order to make sure that you deviating from international law requirements themselves will be very hard. It has to be almost malicious, and we almost never see that. So it's very important, and there's always the challenge when you deal with most of the public will look at an event and the effects of that event. Okay, so you will see an attack, and you will see dead civilians, sometimes dead children. And then starts the race in people's minds as to which narrative they would like to adopt. And it's very easy to adopt a narrative according to which, obviously, this is such an exceptional scenario in which you have dead children. Somebody had to be a criminal in order to get to that point. Because most people, especially in the West, most people, they don't see that in their everyday life.
Right.
But that's not an unreasonable consequence in reality of war.
Right.
That happens. You want to make sure that you will be able to examine all these cases, make sure, but first of all, be able to report that to your own public at home, because the Israeli public is also very, has a lot of trust in its soldiers, and you want to make sure that the soldiers operate the right way in the battlefield. And you will not gain that trust if you don't have this process of examining that and reporting when you find exceptional cases, and you do that also in order to have the dialogue with the international community, which also have high expectations from Israel being a democratic state.
So only one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and in fact, I'm sorry because I'm hearing an echo on the headset, so I'm actually going to take mine off. But we'll carry on if you're experiencing the same thing. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is the question of why. Why should a law student in the United States of America want to hear about the Israel Defense Forces experiences prosecuting the laws of armed conflict against non-state actors, essentially terrorist organizations? Now, I know the answer to that. I don't think most people know the answer to that. Can you just explain the relevance of Israel's experience to the story of essentially democratic states, in my view, writ large, if you would?
Well, first of all, I mean, let's not kill ourselves. Okay, the conflicts Israel has been engaging with for so many years have always been at this right at the center of world's attention. Okay, so it will always be a hot subject for anyone, But for a student that's interested in international law, not just as you can read about it in the books. What other place rather than Israel would be more appropriate for him to learn about that, about the practice of international law? And there is, let me tell you that. I mean, there is the gap between what you learn in the academia and what's out there in the world of practice. Okay, because it's always very easy to remember all the rules and know what's the theory of international law, but if you don't have a chance to try to apply it to real life scenarios, then it remains in the theoretical sphere, and that's a great chance for great opportunity for law students to hear more about the experience of doing all these experiments in international law in real life laboratory, if you will, of that law.
And I've always thought that when one considers that the US, France, Germany, the UK, Australia, and many other democratic states, without offering an opinion about the virtue or the lack of virtue about any particular military campaign, they are all engaged in implementing the laws of armed conflict in asymmetrical warfare, all of them. But what's unique about Israel, for better, for worse, is that I believe it to be the only democratic state that's doing so on I wouldn't say on a regular basis, but on a relatively frequent basis, about an hour's drive from its capital city.
Yeah.
Whereas others are doing this thousands of miles away, which makes Israel a particular laboratory of thought on this issue, I think.
So that's a critical point, okay? So while we have dialogue with all the countries you mentioned, and I have the highest regards for the international lawyers and for their also for the morals, the values they represent. I think in so many ways that these are the same values that we represent. Most of the forces of these countries are expeditionary forces, and they go fighting in other, in places in the world which are very remote from their countries. The IDF is not an expeditionary force. Mm-hmm. We always fight on our borders. And since Israel is such a tiny country, the borders are very close to the soldiers' homes. If you take we talked about the fact that we have a mandatory service. You'll take an 18-year-old teenager being drafted to the IDF. He lives in one of the communities near the Gaza border. He might be actually seeing his own home while he's fighting in Gaza, just 1 mile away from him. Okay, so that makes a huge difference for these people, and the implementation of the international law in these scenarios is that's not just an experiment. That's real life for us. That's real life. That's very practical, and there's so many challenges in that. So because there's the balancing you have to make is always very how shall I put it? It's when you need to when you fight for your own home, and you know that the decisions you make will also affect your own family. Mm-hmm. It becomes much more concrete to you.
Yeah, and mentioning the Gaza Strip, it's very clear to me that almost axiomatically at the point of any conflict breaking out there, before any numbers are in, before any sophistication of understanding is acquired, there are huge elements in the international community that will immediately level a charge of its disproportionality on the parts of the Israel Defense Forces, and the way that they calculate this disproportionality that they speak of is really quite absurd. The idea being that on one side of the conflict, inside the Gaza Strip, there are X number of people who have been killed, and on the other side of the conflict, inside the states of Israel, there are Y number of people being killed,
and Y is
lower. Yeah. And so if X is higher, then X must equal disproportionality. and that is simply not the legal case. And I've heard you press this very, very clearly. It's very straightforward in my mind, but I'd like people to hear it from you, and just explain why this notion, this accusation of disproportionality based on a simple count is so inaccurate and fails so utterly to really describe the situation.
Yeah, you will encounter this misconception, misunderstanding of the term of proportionality very often. You will see it in the media. Many people, many people in the audiences I'll meet will think so, and you also find it in papers that you might expect to be more professional, such as international bodies reports referring to that. So the legal term of proportionality is quite different. So basically, when a military commander has to carry out an attack, he will have to consider what will be the military advantage that he will gain from the attack, and then consider what will be the collateral damage expected from the attack. And he may only carry out the attack as long as the collateral damage is not excessive comparing to the military advantage. That's it. So obviously there's no formula for that. It's a case-by-case examination, and you have to look at each and every attack separately, independently. Otherwise, the analysis you make is worth nothing. Okay, so when you cannot just look at the end of the operation at the total tally of casualties on either side and decide, okay, there must have been a disproportionate pattern of operations there. You have to look. Yeah, that's very easy to do, right? Like just looking at two numbers. No, there's no easy way of doing that.
Right.
Or this analysis, you have to. In Operation Protective Edge in 2014, the IDF attacked more than 6,000 targets from the air alone. That's only the air campaign.
Right.
We're not talking about several thousands of other targets from the ground. When you look at these attacks from the air, you have to look at each and every attack separately. What was the military objective of the attack? What was the intelligence about it? What was the military advantage that was expected to be gained? What was the assessment as to the collateral damage? There is no way of doing that, just as, in general. There's no generalization in that. And when you read so the only body that has all the information is the IDF, okay? That's the military that actually made all the choices to attack.
Right.
And you read all these reports, they just take a few examples. Okay, they'll take a few examples of specific attacks, and they will say, well, based on these examples, Israel has been disproportionate. Well, that's egregious. That's ridiculous. This is so unprofessional doing that. There's no way of doing that. So that's just in very general terms when we talk about proportionality. But if you look at the roots of having so many civilian casualties in these scenarios, what are the roots for that? So obviously each party to the conflict has an also obligation not only to mitigate civilian harms in his adversary's side, but also in his own side. So you have an obligation to defend your civilian population. The IDF has an obligation to distinguish itself, for instance, from civilian environment in order to allow its adversaries to know that they are able to attack only IDF soldiers who are legal targets in international law. And the same goes if we talk about Gaza, about Hamas. Okay, they also have to make sure that they do not operate among the civilians. But what we see on the ground is quite the opposite. We see a very clear modus operandi of them embedding themselves within the civilian surrounding. It's very clear. We've seen it in writing. We found military manuals referring to that, Hamas military manuals referring to the advantages of doing so. Okay, so and it's very easy when you're a terror groups and you don't have any international law that you have to follow. Okay, so that's them. So obviously when you do that, you make it much harder for your adversary, in this case the IDF, to conduct its operations. So we are heavily invested with so many in developing all these tools to allow us to carry out our operations while distinguishing the combatants from the civilian population. But even when you do all that, that's a natural consequence of these operations in urban surroundings. We've seen it all around the world, that you will also have civilian casualties. And let me tell you this, the ratios for the civilian casualties in the operation the IDF has been engaged in are very low. They indicate the fact that the IDF is very professional in its military operation. Okay, even after dealing with all these challenges put by Hamas to this arena, the numbers are still very good. So the loss of every civilian life is obviously tragic, and we do whatever possible, whatever we can in order to avoid that. But that's, there's no way of getting to a zero civilian casualties. So that when you look at an case by case examination of all of these attacks, you get to a point when you realize that the IDF is very professional in these operations.
And then the other thing that I've heard you make mention of, and then maybe I'll just ask you one other point before we part company, but this idea that the legal threshold is much, much lower than is the moral threshold when it comes to the actions of soldiers. I don't even know that should be limited to one particular military, incidentally. It seems to be something that I hear being spoken about as I hear you dialoguing with law professors here,
yes,
and law students and military veterans on the subject of the laws of armed conflict. Just explain, or maybe you could even give an example of an occasion whereby there's a strike that's being planned or a particular maneuver that's being planned, and you are asked to give your legal advice as to the legitimacy of that maneuver, and it's forthcoming and it's approved, but it's refused and rejected, not the advice but the implementation, by the commander on the ground. Tell everyone about that, if you would.
Okay, so that's very interesting because, in many people think that, first of all, that law means morals, okay? And I don't think the lawyers are in charge of the morals.
You think
okay?
Most people think law means morals?
Many people. They tell me, are you in charge of the morals of the IDF? No.
I don't know, I've heard some jokes about lawyers that lead me to think people think other. But anyway,
no.
Okay.
Let's talk about international lawyers,
Okay.
Not like corporate lawyers.
Right, okay.
No offense. But, the people sometimes tell you, are you in charge of the morals of the IDF? Because I have something to tell you. I'm not in charge of the morals of the IDF, okay? We have the commanders. They're in charge of the morals of the IDF. I'm only in charge of making sure that everything is being done according to the law. Mm-hmm. Now, the legal threshold is the minimum, okay? You have the legal requirements. You cannot violate them. That's a minimum. But then, if you look at, for instance, international law, we talk about the notion of collateral damage. What does it mean? It means that international law makes a very delicate balance between the military necessity and the civilian casualty. It aims to mitigating civilian harm, yet it acknowledges the fact that you will have civilian casualties in war. Okay, and you will also have it in many cases. You will know in advance that the end result of your military operation will be those casualties. Okay, so international law basically allows you in some circumstances to kill civilians. So that's the legal threshold. But when you have a dialogue with commanders in many cases, many conversations I had with commanders, in many scenarios, they will not accept that. They will say, well, I realize this is the legal threshold. That's not my threshold. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they have a moral threshold. They say, in many cases, I heard that. That's very common to hear. When I know that there will be civilian casualties, I don't want to carry out the attack. I want to, even if it's proportionate in legal terms. Okay, I want to, wait for another opportunity to do that. Maybe sometimes just waive the opportunity. But that's their own moral threshold. Okay, that also goes back to the specific circumstances in which the IDF operates. When you have these commanders in their attack cells, for instance, so they have their shifts. I don't know, 12-hour shifts, 16-hour shifts, and at the end of the day, or at the end of the week, they will go back to their families. Nobody wants to go back to his family so soon after his military operation, knowing that he did something that's against his morals. Okay,
that he wouldn't want his children to grow up to emulate.
Yeah, there's no distance
Right.
between where he works and where he lives, and that's pretty much the same space. Okay, and he wants the space to be as cohesive, as coherent as possible. Okay, he wants the same morals that he applies at home to be applied at work, because this is pretty much the same environment for him. It's very close. It's close in time. It's close in geography, and I think that's very interesting. Okay, there's no separation created between what's happening back home and what's happening while I'm here in serving in the IDF, in the military. These are two very close environments, and in many ways they overlap each other. There's a permeation of both of them. So I think that's my interpretation. But in many cases, you hear the people around you speak about that. I went back home last night. I told my wife about something I did. So, it's the family and what it represents for people is very much also involved in what they do in their service.
So I said that I would ask one more thing, but I'm going to ask two, and I know that you're on limited time, so I appreciate you indulging me. The first is that there is a perception somehow that Israel is very much a nation that dwells alone, that it doesn't have a friend in the world. Some might say it has a great friend in the United States, but if you push them to name other friends, the list will very, very quickly come to an end. And I've actually perceived that certainly within the Mag Corps and in the realm of your peers around the world, there do seem actually to be some tremendously understanding audiences and contemporaries that you have in other militaries. Can you just give me an example of some of those, or correct me if you think that I'm mistaken? It seems that there is almost, I wouldn't say a reverence shown towards the work undertaken, but there's a deep professional respect. And that, of course, when you consider that those lawyers are also advising their militaries and their governments and so forth, I think that can have very, very positive implications that are not necessarily seen and appreciated by everyone. Do you align with that thought?
Let me just start by challenging the assumption you started with. I don't think Israel dwells alone in the world. I think Israel is a very respected member in the international community, and we might face criticism at some points, but everybody around us in the world looks at the enormous achievements we've made in 70 years, and the respect that very much. In many places, they also admire that. I travel all around the world. I get many responses from many different peoples. People around the world admire Israel and what's its achievements and what it represents in the world. So let me just refer to the first sentence you used. Now, especially when we talk about international lawyers around the world, they are very much aware, especially practitioners, okay, those who have to engage with, in doing all these analyses and applying the international law in their everyday life. They know what are our dilemmas, what are our challenges, and they have an immense respect to what we do. In so many ways, I think we're in the front line of the implementation of international law. There's a deep appreciation to the professional level that our lawyers exercise in their everyday operations, and we can see that there is no venue in the world who will not have an Israeli speaker or as many speakers as possible.
Right.
I wish we could send all our lawyers to all of these venues as often as we could. We don't have enough people to
To fill the demand.
To fill the demand,
Right.
exactly. There's a huge demand for Israeli speakers, for the Israeli experience in international law, and you know, you will have a professional dialogue. Sometimes you will hear, you know, many other interpretations to the law, not necessarily the same as yours, but that's okay. This is a valid academic dialogue. And we are more than happy to engage in that. And many things that Israel has been doing in the past as part of its practice has become the world practice. And like if you look at targeted killings, 2 decades ago, that was exceptional. Now it's so many countries are, you know, this is part of their operations, of their practice. So I feel we're very much, very well respected in the world for that.
And the last thing I wanted to ask you about is that how's your experience been with us on these campuses? What do you take from it? What have you noted? What's really stood out for you? You know, together we've gone. I mean, we've gone to campuses on the West Coast, in the Midwest, on the East Coast. We've gone to the Ivy Leagues. We've gone to others of high repute. We've gone to areas with a very, very different composition of students,
Yes.
And even to the military academies. What do you take away from this experience, and what can you say about the work that we undertake?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be doing that if, as I said in the beginning, I wouldn't be doing that if I didn't have the deepest acknowledgement, appreciation to the importance of this job. And I really want to thank you for being here and doing this, I would say on behalf of the State of Israel, because, you know, it always feels like it's one drop in a huge ocean around us, but that's one drop more than nothing. And you out there to seed, to send the seeds, to plant them in so many different places. And I like the way in which you know how to prioritize all the venues that you choose. And obviously, when you look at the places you get to, these are the you know, top class venues in this country. So for me, it's always been very important, and I'm very appreciative to the, you know, for you to open the doors for us, for the IDF, for officials from the State of Israel to get to all these places, to be able to, you know, have a discourse with all these important audiences. You know, that's and in many ways that's an ongoing dialogue we have with them. Let me tell you that there's so many cases in which I received emails from you know, people in the audience asking more questions.
Right.
And it's very important that, you know, when you have another conflict and they have questions about that, and you give them the information that they can relay it back to the place that they come from. That's this networking is so important. And it's only because of your operation here in this country, of Us Soldiers Speak. So I'm very appreciative for that, and I want to thank you for allowing us to do that.
Well, I'm very pleased that we've had you here. I think there is definitely a presumption that nobody wants to hear what Israel has to say on this particular matter, that the presumption of guilt is there from the outset, that we're not going to win over an audience. And I think that that's absolutely ill-founded and wrong.
I agree with you.
The reality is that if you bring and facilitate a high-level speech by an expert, such as yourself, and you put them in front of people who wish to challenge the viewpoint, but do it from a position of being informed and with a basis to even the toughest of questions, then a conversation